Yuval Levin, our guest, is the founding editor of National Affairs and the director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff under President George W. Bush and was executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics. He is the author of several books on political theory and public policy. Most recently, The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. Dr. Levin's current scholarship focuses on the ongoing decay of American institutions. In early 2020, he will publish his next book, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. And I believe he also attended the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, which is an 8-year PhD. Is that right?
It's not meant to be an 8-year PhD, but it often is an 8-year PhD.
But it takes that long. Anyways, please welcome our guest, Dr. Yuval Levin.
Thank you. It's, for some people, more like an 18-year PhD. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come again to Yale and at the invitation of the wonderful Buckley program. This is the third of 3 lectures that you've asked me to deliver this fall, spaced out about a month apart. A lot of you have been to the other 2, so you're clearly gluttons for punishment, or you lost a bet, or you owe it to somebody to be here, and I appreciate it enormously. My subject in these talks has been the health or ill health of some of the core institutions of American society. In the first lecture, I took up the question of how to understand the decline of public confidence in institutions, thinking through just what institutions are, what we expect of them, what it means to trust them and to lose that trust. In the second of these last month, I took up some examples in politics, in the professions, in the academy, and civic life, and tried to sketch out a pattern of institutional deformation by which people within some of our key institutions have come to think of them less as molds that shape their character and behavior and more as platforms for themselves to be seen and to perform. And that pattern, I suggested to you, is crucial to some of the facets of the social crisis that our society confronts in this period. Today I want to talk about one of the most prominent and dangerous implications of that crisis, the way in which our elite institutions have lost their legitimacy in the eyes of a lot of the American public and have set off a massive populist upheaval. And then to talk about what might be done to take on these kinds of problems, to push back against the frustration and the alienation that so define our public life now, and to rebuild some confidence and trust and legitimacy in American life. To do that, I think we have to start by thinking about this term, legitimacy, which does seem to be at the heart of a lot of our troubles. At first glance, a democratic society like ours should be the least troubled by the demands of legitimacy. The institutions of democratic societies tend to wear their claims to valid authority on their sleeves. Elected governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Cultural and social and economic power also ultimately answers to citizen and to consumer preferences a lot of the time, at least generally speaking. No one asserts a right to rule here by force or thanks to some kind of birthright. But in fact, I think it's precisely because democratic societies are grounded in egalitarian presumptions that they're constantly troubled and sometimes intensely agitated by concerns about legitimacy. The democratic ideal suggests that a free, equal society should have no privileged class that rules it. But in practice, every society has its elites, one way or another. Elite, this term, has become a kind of insult in our time, but the term almost describes a tautology. Whatever the rules for election to office or rising to influence or power and wealth, some people will rise and some people will not. And those who do rise are society's elite because they've risen. The question is how the elite is determined, selected, populated, replenished. Who gets the privileges of power and status, and for what reasons, on what grounds? Elites in democratic societies are always under pressure to prove that the answers to these questions are sufficient, and so that they're worthy of authority and special standing in an egalitarian society. They have to believe this themselves, or else they'll be racked by debilitating guilt that could eat away their own sense of purpose. And they have to persuade other people of it, or else their power will be a constant provocation to cynicism, to alienation, to self-righteous populism. And the two often go together. An elite that is enervated by self-doubt, that's outwardly smug but guilt-ridden on the inside, is the other side of the coin of an alienated and indignant democratic public, outwardly contemptuous of all establishments, but inwardly starving for legitimate authority. The combination of the two, a combination that we know all too well in contemporary America, amounts to what I would call a crisis of legitimacy, like the one we're living through. The effects of that kind of crisis go well beyond a simple disrespect for people in power, or even anger at the unfairness of the privileges they have. This mix of guilt and resentment creates a sense of distance between elites and the public, which in turn leads the public to feel that its leaders look down on its way of life and disrespect it. It also fuels a perception that the rules of American life are rigged against the many for the benefit of a privileged few. And all of that contributes to the alienation that pervades contemporary social life, that discourages people from participating, from engagement, and that fuels outrage in a lot of parts of our national life. In other words, the impression that power and wealth are distributed according to an unjust standard is poisonous to solidarity and to civic unity. We can't feel at home in our society if we think the people in power have their power unjustly. The principles according to which our elite is populated have to somehow be persuasive to us. When we fail to find such a persuasive justification for the privileges of people in power, the tendency of a democratic public is to rebel against that elite, to reject its claims to authority by lashing out against the uses that it makes of that authority, and so to demand that the establishment, whatever we take it to be torn down. But populists are not anarchists. They demand liberation from oppressive authority because they want legitimate authority. And that creates a strange kind of problem in a democratic society. Our politics wants to give people what they ask for. So in a time when what we ask for is different somehow from what we want as citizens, politics tends to be unusually aggravating. That's not only because we aren't getting what we desire, but because what we are getting intensifies that desire. Today, we ask for a politics of breaking down authority, when what we often really want is more respectable authority. So when our politics breaks down authority, it only sharpens our sense of what it is we're missing. We can see that in the peculiar appeal of various kinds of confident claims to authority outside of our politics right now, like the attraction of some younger Americans to streams of orthodox religion that reject liberal political ideals, and to some secular moralisms that unabashedly demand self-discipline, like the appeal of Jordan Peterson, for example. We can see it, too, in the appeal of an identity politics on the left that, for all of its faults, draws clear lines between oppressor and oppressed. The attractiveness of these kinds of things should tell us something about what we actually want from our politics, which is something very different from the kind of antinomianism that it often offers us today. And all of that is made worse in our time by an elite politics that responds to the populist demand to demolish authority by just defending the status quo. This easily becomes an ugly cycle that we're used to. Frustrated voters want more legitimate authority, but demand the demolition of authority and are answered with a doubling down on what they perceive to be illegitimate authority. That creates a situation in which everyone can manage to be smug and wrong and frustrated at the same time. And its effects are apparent well beyond our politics. Frustration with elite claims to authority drives a loss of confidence in professionalism and in expertise, particularly when experts insist on deploying their authority as a weapon in the culture war and politics. Any effort to address this escalating frustration should naturally point us back to the question of institutions that I've taken up with you in these lectures throughout the fall. Because whether we see it or not in the midst of our daily aggravations, elite authority is unavoidably channeled through elite institutions. That's why populist frustration with elite authority is so often expressed as a loss of faith or confidence in institutions. It's why reconsidering our expectations of institutions, while reforming those institutions to help them better live up to our expectations, could help to assuage some of this crisis. More functional elite institutions could do precisely what today's elite requires: constrain and direct and form authority in ways that are better suited to persuading people of its legitimacy. But they can do that not by serving our elites so much as by forming them to serve the broader public. The alternative to corrupt elite institutions is not anti-institutional populism, but better elite institutions. We can't do without such institutions, and so we need to invest our energies not in tearing them down, but in building them up and improving them. Some institutions really are corrupt and broken, and to respond to their brokenness in a spirit of repair rather than of reprisal is difficult and seems unnatural to us in our politics, but it is essential now. It may be the only way to take up the challenge of legitimacy that confronts us in so many places in American society. To see how that might be achieved, we should notice something about how our crisis of legitimacy is connected to the transformation of our expectations of institutions, from seeing them, as I've offered here before, as molds of character, to seeing them as platforms for performance. That change in our expectations has expanded the freedom of action of America's political, cultural, and economic elites, and that has intensified the suspicion and mistrust that the larger public harbors toward these powerful people. Institutions that are understood as formative are inherently constraining. They provide the people in them with boundaries and procedures, with a code of behavior, standards of integrity, and formal responsibilities that help direct their ambitions and abilities toward a broadly shared purpose. In other words, they have the potential to humble and restrain our elites in the process of empowering them. They can offer frameworks for legitimacy. Institutions understood as performative, on the other hand, only further hone an already aggravating sense of entitlement. They provide prominent platforms for people with power, but they don't necessarily establish boundaries or restraints, and so they don't offer ways to make authority more legitimate. Elites can establish their legitimacy in basically two ways, which usually have to be combined: by making sure that opportunities are available for other people to rise into the elite, and by using their own power and privilege with restraint and for the greater good. These are both, in different ways, challenging in a democratic society. For much of American history, the first of these requisites for elite legitimacy was the more obviously lacking. The apex of American political, cultural, and economic power was largely the preserve of a fairly narrow, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant near-aristocracy centered in the Northeast, centered, frankly, right here. These near-aristocrats, known as WASPs, though of course they were only a small sliver of America's white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, composed this elite. They were raised to rule and exercise extraordinary power in some key American institutions through the middle of the 20th century. Their claim to that power, like that of most modern aristocracies, was a mix of heritage and rearing. They possessed their privilege by virtue of their birth, but they were raised and educated in ways intended to prepare them for responsibility and for authority. And they were, at least in principle, though in many cases also in practice, expected to subject themselves to a code of behavior, a commitment to public service, a degree of personal reticence, a regard for the rules of fair play, and a sense of responsibility rooted in the implicit recognition that their power was an inherited privilege, not an earned achievement. Obviously, even this limited moral code of this kind of noblesse oblige never lived up to its ideals in practice. The WASPs, like any elite, were frequently arrogant, entitled, and guilty of abuses of power, but they did internalize and institutionalize their code of behavior in ways that meant that those kinds of abuses were also hypocrisies, and that did act to restrain and form and direct the behavior of some American elites. Their faults were many, but these near-aristocrats also achieved a lot right through the era of the construction of America's mid-century institutions in response to the Great Depression and the Second World War and the emergence of the Cold War. But by the middle of the 20th century, it was becoming clear that these claims to power could not remain persuasive as our culture became more liberal and democratic. The WASPs were undone by the exclusive nature of the criteria for entrance into their elite, which oftentimes excluded those not born into a narrow northeastern gentry and almost entirely excluded Catholics and Jews and women and racial minorities. That kind of discrimination not only became untenable in a society growing more inclusive and diverse, but also became intolerable to the WASP elite itself, which gradually lost its own sense of legitimacy and became persuaded that its institutions would need to open themselves to outsiders and adopt new criteria for ascent to the heights of American life. In line with the democratizing spirit of the age, these criteria somehow had to avoid special favor and privilege, and this meant almost unavoidably elevating an elite whose membership was determined by some kind of measure of ability or intellect. This idea was not new. It had been the organizing principle of the professional civil services that had taken shape throughout the West in the 19th century, and in some respects it reached back to Confucian China and earlier. Some set of exams which might be relied upon to offer relatively objective measures of relevant abilities would serve to filter potential elites. The people who scored high enough would be set on a path toward authority and privilege, and that kind of filtering would take no account of family background or of race or sex or religion or ethnicity or other such things. All that would matter would be some kind of measure of merit. And so was born the American meritocracy. The term meritocracy is generally attributed to Michael Young, a British intellectual, a member of Parliament from the Labour Party, who coined it in the title of a 1958 book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. The book was a work of fictional social commentary, and the term meritocracy was intended to be entirely pejorative. The book takes the form of a history of British social evolution, supposedly written in 2034, which describes the replacement of Britain's aristocratic ruling classes by a caste of the best and the brightest, measured by tests of intelligence. For Young, meritocracy was not the natural extension of democracy, but a complete betrayal of democracy. He could clearly see that just finding a new way to select a narrow ruling class was not going to address concerns about the narrowness of the ruling class, and that basing power and privilege on intellect could easily make things a lot worse. His book is basically a dystopia. But for reformers of America's elite institutions, many of them guilt-ridden wasps themselves, meritocracy did seem like an extension of democracy, because it involved broadening the criteria for joining the upper reaches of American life. Filtering for elites by testing for some objective measure of merit would create a much fairer upward path in our society for anyone who showed ability, regardless of where he or she might come from. And by the 1970s, the term meritocracy, employed now without its original pejorative meaning, was in common use among American reformers, particularly of higher education. Because elite colleges are the king's highway into every other elite institution, higher education has been at the center of meritocratic reforms from the start. Basing admissions on standardized testing, especially on the SAT, offered a way to select students from a relatively broad range of backgrounds. The appeal of the tests was not so much that they measured the particular skills or abilities that were most relevant to succeeding in college, as that they measured those relevant skills and abilities that could be quantified without regard to an applicant's other characteristics. They offered a single objective standard of comparison, and so they would break the stranglehold of the patrician WASP families on the elite colleges. The new approach to admissions quickly allowed for more Catholic and Jewish students in elite universities, and over time for more Asian students and more African American and Hispanic students, while the integration of women into elite universities, especially starting in the 60s and 70s, meant that these schools also stopped being boys' clubs. Although family legacy admissions certainly continue, and the WASP lines are still overrepresented in places like this, there's no doubt that today's American elite is far less narrowly drawn in terms of race and ethnicity and religion and sex, and that has opened up opportunities for able Americans from many backgrounds, and it has diversified our elite dramatically. These elites of different backgrounds nonetheless do have one thing in common. They all measure up by the standards that are now said to represent merit. And yet those standards are by no means self-evidently suited to supplying us with an able and legitimate elite. And they can't avoid the simple and unchangeable fact about elites. They are inherently narrow and exclusive. In fact, our meritocracy has turned out not to be able to avoid even the tendency of elites to become outright aristocracies, that is, to transmit privilege generationally. Thanks to both the sort of mating and powerful incentives to game the tests that grant entry into the American elite, children whose parents are in the upper echelons of American society have a very strong and clearly growing chance of finding themselves in those upper echelons too. For similar reasons, the American elite has actually grown more homogeneous in terms other than race and sex and ethnicity and family connections. Business elites, professional elites, political elites, cultural and media elites, academic elites, not so long ago in America were very distinct groups of people. They had their own characteristics and educational backgrounds, cultural identities, political affiliations, life experiences that were cross-cutting in different ways. The people who ran these different institutions were quite different from each other. But today, we find increasingly a uniform body of elites at the top of all of these different institutions, all of whom share the same kinds of educational background and cultural affinities, political priorities. Different sectors of American society no longer really have their own elites. There's just one elite, and it is increasingly its own sector of American society. But what's worse, this new aristocracy, in some important ways, is less reticent about its own legitimacy than the old one. Because each of its members has had to work in some way to prove his or her merit, to pass the key tests, to clear the key hurdles, today's elite is more likely to believe that it's earned its power, that it possesses it by right than by privilege. Because our elite as a whole is inclined to this view, it tends to impose fewer restraints on its own uses of power, and generally doesn't identify itself with the sort of code of conduct that past aristocracies have at least tried and claimed and pretended to uphold. Even when today's elites devote themselves to public service, as many certainly do, they tend not to see it as the fulfillment of an obligation to give back, so much as the demonstration, yet another demonstration, of their own high-mindedness and merit. A meritocracy naturally assumes that its authority is merited. But rather than prove its worth by service to the larger society, the idea of merit at the core of our meritocracy is radically individualistic and technocratic. Merit is demonstrated by test scores and a glittering resume, and then often is put to use in different kinds of management and administration. The sort of elite that this produces implicitly substitutes a cold and sterile notion of intellect for a warm and spirited understanding of character, and as its basic measure of worth. And our society, including some elites themselves, of course, increasingly can't escape the sense that this is an unjustifiable substitution and makes for a strange kind of leadership class. But rather than impose tests of character on itself, our elite inclines to respond to these concerns with increasingly intense displays of its own ideal of social justice. It doubles down on the logic of meritocracy, adopts the language of privilege in its critiques of the larger society, and pushes for even more inclusive criteria of admission to elite institutions, all in an effort to make its own claims to authority more persuasive. But I think these efforts can miss a simple point. The claims to legitimacy of today's elite are being met with skepticism, not so much because it is too hard to enter the upper tier of American life, though of course often it is, as because those in that tier seem to be permitted to do whatever they want. Our elite is increasingly guilt-ridden, and the broader democratic public is increasingly cynical about its leaders, not so much because too few Americans can get into elite colleges, as because those who do too often go on to exercise their power without enough restraints and evident standards. Precisely because our elite does not think of itself as an aristocracy, it doesn't perceive itself to be in need of restraints. Ironically, to strengthen its case for legitimacy, it might have to understand itself in some ways as more of an aristocracy, and to see that its claims to authority need to be more persuasive to the larger public. But what would it mean for an elite to make itself more persuasive? It would certainly require some sense of what has made it unpersuasive to some Americans to begin with. And our meritocracy, I think, has lacked that sense. We've implicitly mistaken an idea of merit that's meant to broaden the entry criteria into elite educational institutions for an idea of merit that could justify and legitimate authority throughout our society. But authority is not legitimated just by the ways that it's obtained. More often, it ought to be legitimated by the ways in which it is used. The WASP gentry was certainly wrong to close the doors to its powerful institutions to women and to religious and racial and ethnic minorities, but they were not wrong to impose a demanding code of conduct and restraint on those within their institutions. Our elite, however it's formed, requires such restraints and obligations too. So as we think about how the meritocracy might be made less obnoxious to the larger society, we also have to think about how to respond to the fact that it is, in some respects, unavoidably aristocratic. We'll need a code of conduct to which we all might be able to hold one another, but that can be applied especially to people in positions of authority and power and privilege. We'll need ways of making sure in public that people in power are constrained by responsibilities and duties. But what forms could that kind of code of conduct take in our time, in 21st century America? And how could it possibly be imposed? The arrogance of an unchecked elite can't be humbled by formal restraints alone, and the resentment of an alienated public can't be remedied by procedural assurances alone. Both of them require some higher ideals that they might be drawn to in common. Our meritocracy implicitly substitutes intellect for character and efficiency for integrity. That makes for an inherently distasteful attitude among the powerful, but it becomes downright intolerable when our leaders seem not even to be particularly brilliant or effective. In these times in particular, the broader public is forced to ask why it should take elite claims to authority seriously. Why should we trust our institutions and the people who run them? That question has been with us from the start of these conversations about institutions this fall. The basic answer should be a little bit clearer in light of what we've learned in that process. We trust our institutions when they seem to form the people in them to be more worthy of trust and provide everyone else with standards by which to judge those people. But in recent decades, we've watched our institutions gradually lose sight of the importance of that function and instead begin to serve merely as platforms upon which individuals can perform and be seen in our society. To regain our trust, the people who populate our institutions would need to understand themselves through those institutions again, to see their roles formed by their responsibilities, to let their characters be formed by the positions they hold. That would take both institutional reforms and a change of attitudes geared toward a recovery of the formative and so constraining purpose of key social institutions in every facet of American life, in politics and in the professions, in education and in the life of our culture. The kind of institutionalism that would revitalize Congress or the university or the media or churches or civil society would also contribute a lot to the capacity of our institutions to engender trust and legitimacy. That duty-laden institutional question, given my position here, how should I behave? Given that I'm the principal, what should I be doing now? Given that I'm a student, what's expected of me here, is precisely the question that our elites will need to ask and answer persuasively if they're going to make a strong claim to authority. But that kind of question is a challenge to the logic of our meritocracy in a much more than just formal sense. It's a question that implicitly assumes a different standard of merit than our meritocracy does, and in some ways an altogether different understanding of the human person, a more modest, less ambitious anthropology that has a lot to teach us. It's not a coincidence that a performative rather than a formative understanding of institutions has arisen in our particular age of meritocracy. To see institutions as platform for performance is to deny them their role as molds of character, and by extension to deny our very need for that kind of formation. And our culture now often does deny that kind of need. Both the libertarian and the progressive ideals of freedom assume a human person already fully formed, requiring only liberation from oppression of various sorts to be free. The meritocracy itself is rooted in an idea of achievement that tends to take the fact that someone has reached a position of privilege as evidence that that person warrants trust or has paid his dues somehow. The vision of the human person that underlies these kinds of assumptions is loaded with very high expectations of the individual, and it therefore makes only modest demands of institutions. Left to himself, the individual can exercise his capacities and pursue the good. Our institutions only need to enable him, maybe just to display him, to promote him. But this vision has always been opposed in our traditions by a far more skeptical view that assumes a human person who begins imperfect and unformed, maybe fallen. This other ideal comes loaded with rather low expectations of the individual, but it therefore demands a lot of our institutions. It assumes that each of us is born deficient but capable of moral improvement, that such improvement happens soul by soul, person by person, and so can't be circumvented by social or political transformation, and that improvement, the formation of character and virtue, is the foremost work of our society in every generation, all the time. To fail to engage in that work is to regress to a kind of pre-civilizational barbarism, and to engage in it is the essential defining work of our institutions that have to always be fundamentally formative. This more skeptical vision of the human person and the purpose of society's institutions has very deep roots in Western civilization, but it's now very controversial. And the assault on formative institutions in our time has everything to do with just how controversial it's become. It's why we find battles raging around every one of the core formative institutions of our society: family and faith and work and community, education, and our Republican form of government. It helps explain the very shape of our culture wars, I think. Part of the reason this view is so controversial is that it suggests that the fundamental or maybe primary social problem in a society like ours is not the oppression of the weak by the strong, but the fragility of the preconditions for social order and for freedom. If, as Rousseau famously put it, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, and if those chains, as he suggested, are more or less society's oppressive social institutions that deny human beings their rights and liberties, then we can make a better world by standing up for the weak against the strong and breaking those chains on their behalf. But if instead man is born broken and everywhere he is made more whole by society's institutions, then the best way to improve the lot of people in need is to reinforce our institutions and enable more people to benefit from them. Now, of course, both these things are true at the same time. We all require formation, and the weak are very often oppressed by the strong. But which is the primary problem? Which would need to be taken on first in order to also enable us to address the other? I think it can almost be said that the answer that you would offer to that question determines the side of the contemporary culture wars that you would find yourself on. Or at least it tells us something about where you'd fall along the traditional left-right axis that, generally speaking, has given form to liberal politics for centuries. And it has a lot to do with our attitude toward the meritocracy, which after all embodies a form of the idea that our merit is just there to be measured, and that granting privilege and power to those who measure up, regardless of where they come from, is a way of treating everyone fairly. This is one important reason why our most meritocratic institutions tend so often to fall on the left side of the culture war. But it's also an important reason why those meritocratic institutions now face a deep crisis of legitimacy. They demand too little of the people they empower because they expect too much of them. Our meritocratic institutions, including those that are explicitly educational institutions, seem to assume that their purpose is to elevate the people in them more than to shape them, to let those people be who they are rather than make them who they ought to be. And as a result, they fail to offer means of demanding and so of producing integrity and reliability. Their claims to authority are inherently unpersuasive to the larger society. Such claims would be much more persuasive if they were rooted in an institutional ethic that promised restraint and formation and responsibility, and so that set about advancing clearly defined institutional goals in ways that were explicitly intended to demonstrate trustworthiness. That would mean subsuming individual ambition beneath institutional ambition and directing it accordingly. It would mean enabling and expecting the people who populate key institutions in our politics, in our economy and culture to pursue status and prominence within those institutions by advancing the aims and embodying the ethics of those institutions, rather than building their own brands in the vast open space of the larger society by standing on top of these institutions and yelling. And it would mean understanding each institution as giving its participants a place, a role, a set of relationships rooted in their need for formation. The way to take on the crisis of legitimacy that we confront now, in other words, is to reinvest ourselves in some of our core institutions, to work to reform them with integrity in mind, and at the same time to pour ourselves into them, and so to let them mold us. The recovery of a formative idea of institutions is essential to the revival of legitimate authority in our society, without which the future of our free society is at risk. But the lessons that we can learn by investigating that crisis point beyond themselves to a broader teaching about the nature and the purpose and the troubling evolution of American institutions, and so about the preconditions for the kind of renewal that so many Americans are searching for in our society. Americans are clearly, plainly hungry for hope and for renewal. All of us, on every side of all political divides, are more aware than usual now that the status quo is not sustainable as it is. We've seen horrendous failures of responsibility, not only among people we disagree with, but among people who we would like to be able to count on. Abuses of power, whether in Hollywood or in Washington, in the Catholic Church or in the university, are beginning to compel some real moments of reckoning. The sheer unpleasantness of our politics is driving a kind of revulsion that has only begun to take shape. An increasing awareness of the distorting effects of information technology and social media on our minds and our relationships seems also to be on the verge of launching a reaction that may be constructive. Some common denominators among these excesses, like the risks of celebrity culture, the danger of unrestrained cynicism, the costs of irresponsibility, and a mounting crisis of legitimacy, should make us think hard about what we have to demand of our institutions in 21st century America. Again and again, institutional failures seem to be tied to the emergence of a performative ethic over a formative one. Institutions that understand themselves as just interchangeable platforms can't hold those within them accountable to each other or to some ideal they hold in common, and instead they enable individuals to avoid responsibility and to behave antisocially. Just look at Congress, and you have a sense of what I mean by an institution of that sort now. They encourage an outsider mentality that is poisonous to solidarity and legitimacy. They discourage any sense of ownership and obligation. They keep anyone from saying, "This is my responsibility." And that, in turn, creates all kinds of social vacuums that are painfully evident all around us now. We're all tempted at first to conclude that these kinds of problems require that outsiders come in and save us somehow. That's why so much of the energy of our politics is spent tearing down supposedly powerful establishments. But in fact, we don't need more outsiders who pretend that they're just critics with no power. We need more insiders, institutionalists who will be earnest both in their efforts to build frameworks for common action and in their acceptance of the responsibilities, the duties that accompany power. Those in our society who have the most power, our leaders, our elites, need especially to resist the urge to pretend that they are outsiders, as so many of them now pretend. A president who tweets at the Department of Justice understands himself to be an outsider. A member of Congress who spends all his time complaining about Congress isn't behaving like a person with responsibility. But everyone else needs to take that to heart too. We should all accept the responsibilities that come with the positions we hold, whatever those might be. We should ensure that obligations and restraints actually protect and empower us. We need to inhabit these institutions, to love them and to reform them to make them more lovely to others too. In one arena after another of American life, we face the challenge of drawing alienated people back into our institutions. We can point to all kinds of complicated theories about how to build the trust that's required to accomplish that. But the simplest way to do it is for the people who inhabit our institutions, that is, for all of us, to be more trustworthy. And we each can work at that in our different ways. That might seem like a very modest response to the kinds of social problems that we face now. And of course, it's only a partial response. But it also is less modest than it seems, because taking some modest steps together, particularly when they involve thinking differently about ourselves and our roles, can make an enormous difference. If the problem we face, or a significant part of it, is that we've stopped thinking of ourselves as formed and molded by the institutions that surround us, then one key to improving things would be a change of mindset and of expectations. We don't have to figure out how everyone might do this. We just have to do it ourselves, you and me, in small ways, in thinking about how to use our time and our energy, how to pursue our own goals, how to judge success and failures, how to identify ourselves when people ask us who we are, how to measure our responsibilities. Many Americans are not lucky enough to have the benefit of a flourishing family, say, or of the opportunity for rewarding work, or an uplifting education, or a thriving community, or a humbling faith, let alone all of those at once. But some combination of these soul-forming institutions is within the reach of most. And the work of reinforcing them, sustaining the space for them, and putting them within the reach of as many Americans as possible is certainly among our highest and most pressing civic callings now. Each of these kinds of institutions, and all of them, now need our help, and we can help by taking them more seriously. We can give them our time and effort. We can give them our identity and our self-consciousness. We can understand ourselves as defined by the institutions that matter most to us, whatever those are and wherever they are within reach in our lives. We can judge ourselves by their standards, hold ourselves up to their ideals, and take seriously their forms of integrity, aligning our ambition and our pride with theirs. We can serve them by reforming them to make them better able to achieve their potential, and we can serve through them. We can yearn not for the formless autonomy of the independent contractor, but for the rootedness and the responsibility of the member and the partner and the worker and the owner and the citizen. There's a word for attitudes like that. The word is devotion. What's required of us is devotion to the work we do together with other people in the service of a common aspiration, and therefore devotion to the institutions that we compose and inhabit. That kind of devotion often calls for sacrifice and for commitment. It calls on each of us to pledge ourselves to an institution that we belong to unabashedly, to abandon ironic distance and dispassionate analysis and jump in, even to submit to its demands on us. And that kind of devotion is not only necessary, I think it's also actually very attractive to us now. We want objects of devotion. We want something to commit to. Younger Americans especially seem hungry for these kinds of callings, but they often don't see that what they seek is already within their reach. They're confronted mostly with models of dissent and rejection. Even many of our traditionalists are dissenters now, wondering out loud if their inheritance is just a burden, if maybe our way of life has failed. We lack a grammar and vocabulary for articulating what it is we're for. It's easy to be fashionable rebels in our kind of society. It's harder to remind ourselves why our core commitments are worthwhile. That's the kind of case that institutionalism has to involve now, and why it's so crucial. What I'm proposing then here, and in these past several lectures, is a modest change in our stance toward our country and toward the kind of social crisis that it faces now. Not a social revolution or a political transformation, at least not directly. Just a greater awareness of how integrity and trust and confidence, belonging and meaning are established in our lives, and so a greater care about some habits that we've gotten into that tend to cut us off from those things. Thinking and speaking just a little differently about how we live together can make a bigger difference than you might imagine. It can help us see what we've been missing and do what we've been neglecting. It can help us to say what we've only assumed or taken for granted. And small steps like those can make enormous changes possible. They're constructive, and so they build on each other and turn us all into builders. That, in the end, is the character of the kind of transformation that we need in this peculiar and challenging and frustrating political moment. The demolition crews for too long have been allowed to define the spirit of this moment in America, tearing down, uprooting, demolishing. But where we're headed is going to be up to the builders and the rebuilders. And one way or another, that's what each of us should seek to be. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions for Dr. Levin. I'll start off with one. It's kind of a two-part question. First, curious if you've looked at what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do in the UK with the abolition of private schools. He certainly made a similar observation about some of the downfalls of the meritocracy system in the UK, the fact that social mobility is at an all-time low. What do you think about his plan there? It seems harmful to institutions themselves. The second part of my question is, I went to a talk last night, Professor Daniel Markowitz in the law school, who wrote The Meritocracy Trap, and he provided sort of a more Marxist reading of the situation. Kind of central to his claim is that meritocracy has basically created a really tiny sliver at the very top that are very skilled. They certainly work extremely hard. In fact, all they do is work. And who it's hurt the most is the middle class that doesn't have access to these most elite positions and institutions. Yeah. I'm curious what your response would be. If you've read his book, if you've heard of his sort of thesis there.
Yeah, well, thank you for both questions. I'd say, first of all, what's really striking about the kind of thing that Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, as you say, it begins from a diagnosis that I think is related to what I've laid out here, but then it proceeds to a prescription that assumes enormous public confidence in government. And government is one of those institutions that we've lost confidence in. I think we have to be careful about trying to solve the problems we have by pressing on institutions that have lost public confidence, so that solutions now have to look much more like bottom-up ways of building institutions than top-down ways of crushing institutions, which is what Corbyn wants to do. I think it's deeply misguided, even though it begins from a kind of concern that I can recognize and share. I would say the same thing about a lot of what we find proposed now in the Democratic presidential debates, where it seems like if this were a country that would trust its government enough to say, take entire ownership and control of the healthcare system, then I don't think we would be the country that was having the kind of political debates we're having. The solutions that we propose can't look like that, because we have to take seriously the problems we actually have. And a lot of those problems are about public trust and confidence in our institutions. It has to be built up. And that means that it has to be done by giving people more options, more ways to contribute, more ways to build institutions, rather than imagining that we have these great and trusted institutions and we just need to use them more assertively. I don't think that's the nature of the problem we have. The Markowitz book, you know, it's an awfully Marxist book, really unabashedly so. I think I differ pretty fundamentally with the diagnosis, because I think that the diagnosis begins from the premise that everybody in America wants to be in the elite, which I just don't think is right. You know, those of us who have been through the kinds of educational institutions that form our elite can go around imagining that everybody in America wishes they were students at Yale. I'm sorry, it's not true. That's not everybody's idea of what success looks like. And so the problem that's created by the kind of narrow meritocratic way we have of thinking about our elite, it seems to me, has less to do with the fact that it's very hard to get into an institution like this, and more to do with the fact that we don't hold people with power and authority responsible enough when they exercise that power and authority. Think about the college admission scandal, right? This crazy sort of like famous actresses getting their kids into USC or whatever it was. One way of looking at that scandal is to say, well, this is outrageous because everybody needs to fight for those spots in those great schools, and here are people abusing their power to get in there. I don't think that's actually what troubles people about that scandal. What you see there is people who have a lot of money and a lot of privilege and power behaving as though rules don't apply to them. And the problem with it is not that everybody wants their kids instead to go to these schools. The problem is that everybody in our society has to somehow be held up to a standard and to exercise responsibility and especially people who have power and people who have money, have to take seriously the kinds of constraints that are imposed on them by being Americans and by having positions of power in our institutions. The fact that that's not done is the problem, and I don't think that's going to be solved not by affirmative action and not by different ways of thinking about college admissions. It has to be solved by a different way of understanding the responsibility that people with power have. And that's why I've been emphasizing institutions in these conversations, because I think that's really the only way to impose that kind of ethic on people with power in our society.
Thank you, Doctor, for your wonderful series of lectures. The question I'd like to ask concerns the distinction between meritocracy and aristocracy. How are we to contain vitriol against inherited privilege or inherited positions of power and increasingly apparent mechanisms of perpetuating this, when the assumption would be that the individual has warranted this success? Because perhaps it's easy to see, okay, it was the first generation, maybe the second, but how do you explain the fact that the third, the second, or the fourth, the third, the fourth, or the fifth are still garnering the same success, perhaps without having undergone the same tribulations that would make them merit them?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is an enormous problem for the institutions of our meritocracy, because there's no question that over time they've become more and more aristocratic. That is, they do transmit the benefits and privileges. One way to think about this is that the transformation into meritocracy that happened in higher education in particular happened once. It happened in the 1950s through the 1970s. And from then on, what you have is a new kind of aristocracy, because the children of people who were now newly able to get into these universities, but before had been denied access, are much more likely to be able to get into those universities than the children of other people. And so we had one immense broadening of the immense opening of the gates into institutions like this one. And after that, what you have is, I think, in some respects, a kind of new aristocracy. Not simply so. It is still possible to rise from nowhere and prove yourself and get into a great school. It happens all the time. But it does happen less and less, not more and more. And in part because we learn over time how to game these tests, and that happens a lot now. In time, because people who meet at Yale and then get married and have kids, their kids are just more likely to get into Yale. There's no way around it. It's not the fault of the admissions office. It's the fault of the way we think about what it means to get into these institutions. And so that suggests to me that it's not ultimately possible to address the kinds of challenge that's posed to a democratic society by these kind of semi-aristocratic institutions by managing the entry criteria into those institutions. So I would say, again, what's more important is making sure that people who earn a privileged place in our society by going to Yale and Harvard then have real responsibilities. Some of these are like professional responsibilities. You know, going to law school doesn't mean that you're then the master of the universe. Going to law school means that you then have to serve the public as counsel, offering advice. That's what a lawyer does. A profession gives you that kind of sense that there are standards and obligations that you have to be held up to, and that the fact that you get to be in that position means that you're responsible for living up to certain standards. I think that we've lost some sense that that's what it means to become a professional, to become a member of the American elite. And so I would stress that more than ways of trying to tinker with admissions to broaden them some. That's worth doing. I'm not opposed to that. But I don't think it's going to address the kind of problem you're talking about.
Thank you very much. I find I'm compelled by most of what you say. When speaking of responsibilities, what do you see as a, for lack of a better word, meritocratic, noblesse oblige looking like in comparison to, let's say, a waspish noblesse oblige or an aristocratic one?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, obviously I don't have a complete answer to that kind of question, but it seems to me that a lot of it would have to take form through, as I suggested before, through professional codes, which I think have really lost their force over time, and especially through the kind of process that we've talked about a little bit in the prior lectures, where in the professional world, you now find that a lot of institutions have become platforms for individuals to elevate themselves and build their own brand rather than to live up to outside standards and criteria of integrity. I think that's a big part of what has to be imposed on that kind of elite. I think some sense that public service is required of people who have these sorts of places has to be reinvigorated. Exactly how to do that, there are a lot of different ways to think about it. People talk a lot now about some kind of required national service for people who graduate college, any college. I can see the appeal of that in principle, in theory. When it actually comes down to having to find something for 4 million 21-year-olds to do, I think we would have a real problem. And underemployed 21-year-olds are a really bad human type. So we should be very careful about that. But I think we have to look for those kinds of ways of making it clear, both by signaling and by real constraints, to people who have risen through a meritocracy, that they've got obligations and not just privileges and power. And that's what strong institutions do. And so I think it's both a cause and an effect of the kind of weakening of public confidence in these institutions, that it's become harder for us to imagine what that could look like. I think the way to get there is through some kind of experimentation in places like this and other elite institutions. And I wouldn't say I've got the answer in advance. You can see it on your face.
Thank you very much for your third
you.
talk here. I'm going to challenge you a little bit.
Right.
The idea that institutions should shape their members is good, but it's only good up to a point, I would say. That is, even after, if the government was perfectly working in Britain, as perhaps it did in the 50s, although I doubt it did, it still wouldn't be competent to reshape the public schools, the private schools. If a university like this, all of its members were perfectly self-effacing, it still wouldn't be competent to talk about, we need to change our pronouns, or we need to change our Halloween costumes. Mm-hmm. There are just some limits that have to be put on, and just being self-effacing doesn't create limits.
Yes, I agree with you. I'm talking about how to make things better, not how to make things perfect. I don't think you're ever going to have a government that's competent to run society and all of its institutions. That's just a function of human nature. And similarly, I think the limits of human nature mean that there are limits on what we can expect any of our institutions to achieve. But we could do a lot better in giving people models of integrity that they can take seriously than we're doing now. I think we've done somewhat better in the past in some ways, not in all ways, and we can do better in the future in some ways. So I certainly am not pointing to a utopian ideal. I'm a conservative, and I don't think utopian ideals are real. But I think we can do better by taking seriously exactly those constraints and understanding that we need to be corrected as human beings. We start out needing formation, and we always need formation at every point in our lives. And that's part of what our institutions do for us. That's the extent of it. We could do better.
Further questions? I had one more. I was reading something last week. I can't remember who the author was. I think it was in Vox, that made a distinction between sort of the two prevailing types of criticism of meritocracy in society today. There's sort of the Markowitz Ian, which is more of a principled rejection of meritocracy, that it was flawed from their very beginning, and that what we're seeing, the problems we're seeing, it's working as it's designed. Then there's the aspirational kind of critique, which is the one you've talked about tonight, which is sort of the real meritocracy has never been tried sort of argument. What credence do you give to that argument? You said we can never get to a perfect place, but what are some of the more concrete changes that you think we could make? Yeah. You said leave college admissions alone.
Well, I think that these critiques are related to each other, right? They're not entirely separate from each other. there are problems that are inherent to meritocracy, that are inherent to this way of thinking about how to justify power in society, which is part of what meritocracy does for us. And those are evident in, as I suggested, when Michael Young came up with the term meritocracy, he meant it in a bad way. He meant it as a way of explaining why the best and the brightest is not a good way to think about who should have power. I think there's a lot of truth to that. At the same time, there is, in fact, an injustice inherent in the way that our elite institutions used to allow people into them. There was a need for transformation of how places like this admit students and of how we think about how you make it up in American society in general. That did need to happen, but our expectations of what that could achieve should be much more constrained than they were. The kinds of institutions that work this way, that are meritocratic, are not therefore in a position to decide for us who should rule and who should have power in our society. We have at the same time democratic institutions. We also have at the same time other kinds of institutions, traditional religious and cultural and social institutions that should continue to exist alongside both modern democracy and contemporary meritocracy. I think a diversity of institutional forms in our society is a healthy way to get around those problems, because the formal critique and the aspirational critique are both right, and they're related to each other.
Me and
Thank you very
thanking
much.
Dr. Yuval Levin.
Appreciate it.